thank you for joining us for this inspirational discussion on due diligence. I am Krista West, Director of Learning here at ASI, and I'll be leading you through the discussion today. As we do at the beginning of every discussion, I would like to remind all viewers of the ASI Antitrust Compliance Policy. If you are not familiar with this policy, I direct you to our website on the Legal, Finances and Policies tab under About ASI, where you can download a full copy for review. The OECD has defined due diligence as an ongoing proactive and reactive process through which companies can identify and assess risks and design and implement a strategy to respond to identified risks. Due diligence in minerals and metals supply chains is becoming an important expectation from stakeholders, and increasingly we've seen supply chains be subject to regulation in both the United States and the European Union. While initially the focus was on tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, it is expected that the focus will cover a wider range of metals in future years. The OECD has developed due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and the third edition, which came out in April 2016, recommends its application to all mineral resources, not just conflict minerals. While aluminium is not seen as a conflict mineral per se, the principles of due diligence to manage supply chain risks are sound, and it makes a lot of sense for ASI members to harmonize with these processes. As you know from previous webinars, ASI certifies the facilities, the photos or boxes in this diagram, in the supply chain under the performance standard, and we certify the flow of material through the supply chain, the green arrows in this diagram, under the chain of custody standard. Because of this model, ASI is well posed to address due diligence throughout the aluminium supply chain. Starting with a look at the performance standard, due diligence is covered in Principle 2. The requirements in the performance standard are for a sourcing policy to cover all goods and services utilized at a certified facility. Principle 2, Criteria 2.4 requires that the entity implement a responsible sourcing policy covering environmental, social, and governance aspects at each facility within the certification scope. In the corresponding performance standard guidance document, there are several points to consider in the development, adoption, and implementation of a responsible sourcing policy. Companies should seek to address risks to people or environment commensurate with the company's control or influence over the supplier of the good or service. Larger companies should consider using tools such as supplier due diligence processes, risk evaluations, sustainability questionnaires, integration of sustainability in contracts, supplier audits, and ad hoc teams to address identified issues. Companies should consider making the sourcing policy publicly available and should communicate it to all suppliers. Lastly, companies should consider regularly monitoring and measuring progress in relation to the policy's goals. Now looking at the ASI chain of custody standard. Due diligence for aluminium sourced outside of the ASI certified supply chain is covered in Principle 7. While the performance standard requires a sourcing policy dealing with all goods and services utilized at a facility, the chain of custody standard requires due diligence solely on non-ASI aluminium and recycled scrap material. Criteria 7.1 requires that CoC certified facilities adopt and communicate a responsible sourcing policy for both non-CoC material and recyclable scrap material. This policy should minimally address anti-corruption, responsible sourcing, human rights due diligence, and conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Criteria 4.1 that deals with post-consumer scrap specifies also that suppliers of post-consumer scrap apply the requirements of due diligence laid out here to their supply chains. In the corresponding chain of custody guidance document, there are several points to consider in the development, adoption, and implementation of a responsible sourcing policy. The policy should address relevant criteria in the performance standard. ASI members in the Production and Transformation membership class will already be doing this under their certification for the performance standard. However, ASI members in the Industrial Users membership class don't have these requirements under the performance standard and thus need to consider them here in the chain of custody standard. Guidance can be found in the corresponding sections of the performance standard guidance document. The policy can additionally cover other specific risk areas. Other risk areas may include biodiversity management in relation to bauxite mining and/or alumina refining, bauxite residue management in relation to alumina refining, greenhouse gas emissions in relation to casthouse products, and health and safety in relation to scrap collection and sorting. The policy should be communicated to suppliers. And lastly, the policy should be as simple or as detailed as suits the organization. In addition to developing a sourcing policy, Criteria 7.2 of the Chain of Custody Standard requires that certified facilities assess the risk of noncompliance with the policy developed under Criteria 7.1, document these findings, and undertake measurable risk mitigation where risks of adverse impacts are identified. Several points of consideration can be found in the Chain of Custody Guidance document. There, it is suggested that the policy should be applied to Tier 1 suppliers. Companies can consider addressing further risk by asking their Tier 1 suppliers to assess their own suppliers. Due diligence efforts should be scaled to the size of the supplier. Additionally, the guidance document suggests that informal or very small scrap dealers may present particular challenges for due diligence. This can involve both identifying and mitigating worst practices where present, but there is also a potentially valuable role that entities can play in supporting the formalization and improvement of this sector. The guidance suggests that you make sure you document your findings and any subsequent mitigation measures, and it references the OECD due diligence guidance that aims to promote significant and measurable improvement within 6 months of the adopted risk management plan. It is acknowledged in the OECD guidance that some situations have a higher degree of complexity than others. Lastly, the risk assessment and opportunity to mitigate risk vary depending on the organization's sphere of influence. Lastly, aligning with the OECD guidance, the Chain of Custody Standard requires under Criteria 7.3 that certified entities have established a complaints mechanism that allows interested parties to voice concerns about non-compliant sourcing. In the corresponding Chain of Custody Guidance document, there are several points to consider in the development of the complaints mechanism. Firstly, it's noted that the ASI complaints mechanism does not replace the need for the entity to have its own separate mechanism under the Chain of Custody Standard. The entity's complaints mechanism should be documented, and information about it should be publicly available so that interested parties can be aware that a formal mechanism is in place. The document should describe the types of complaints that are admissible and are not admissible, and the procedures followed in investigating and addressing complaints. Smaller businesses probably only need a simple procedure documented. Note that concerns raised about any CoC material must also be drawn to the attention of ASI so that they can be investigated by the ASI complaints mechanism. While a bit overwhelming at first, this diagram lays out the possible paths that material may take through the aluminium supply chain up until the choke point at the cast house. Green arrows indicate ASI certified materials, and the blue arrows indicate non-certified material. Primary aluminium sourced at the bauxite mine is on the left-hand side of this diagram, while aluminium sourced through the circular economy as recycled aluminium is featured on the right-hand side of the diagram. What is critical to note is that all material entering the ASI certified stream is subject to due diligence, either at the facility, under the performance standard, or as it enters the ASI stream through the Chain of Custody Standard. And here in this diagram, we show the aluminium supply chain post-cast house. On the left side of the diagram, how ASI tracks material through the mass balance system is shown. And on the right-hand side, we show how material is tracked through the market credit system. Again, the critical point here is that all material in the ASI stream is subject to due diligence. Looking at both the supply chain diagrams in the previous slides, as well as the requirements of the relevant due diligence criteria in both ASI standards, we see that risk is significantly reduced throughout and beyond the entire ASI certified supply chain. I thank you for joining us for this inspirational talk on supply chain due diligence. If you should have any questions on this topic or any others, don't hesitate to contact me at krista@aluminium-stewardship.org. All of the documents referenced today can be found at our website. And if you would like to be kept abreast of the activities of ASI, please do sign up for our mailing list, the link which is available at our website.